Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Dobbs. I'm the Executive Director for the Museum of the Rockies, and it is an honor to have all of you here today and Montana World Affairs. Boy, I tell you, what a great organization, and we're so thrilled to be able to partner with you. So on behalf of all of us here at the Museum of the Rockies, thank you so much. I'm going to turn the floor over to Chris Hislop. And Chris, again, thank you for putting this together and the rest of your team. I can't wait for the presentation tonight.
Greetings, everybody. I'm Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council. My colleague Nikki and I would like to welcome you to our very first in-person program post-COVID. In fact, yeah, exactly. We're so pleased that Ambassador Baucus and Tiff could join us, as well as Ambassador Loftus, and we'll introduce them in just a moment. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a couple words about our organization. It's the Montana World Affairs Council, and we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we're dedicated to engaging Montana's communities and schools in global events. Engaging and helping people understand what's going on in the world. And really, I think no better time, given what has been going on in the world and what's going on now, that we can come here to Bozeman, as we have been for many years now, working in schools and communities all across Montana. In fact, for the last 22 years. What we try to do is we're trying to help you and all of us answer three important questions. And that is simply what, so what, and now what, right? Very simple questions. What? What is going on in this situation? What are the facts and what do we know about it? In all of our programs, we're trying to answer that question. But in fact, you can already learn that from that little device that's in everybody's pockets. And you can dial up CNN or Fox News or anything you like and find out what's going on. So we need to go past that. So past what is the so what? In our programs, we're trying to understand, why does this matter to us? Why does it matter to me, to my community, to Montana, and to Montanans? So what? And then after that, we try to help you answer the question, now what? Given we know what's going on and how it may affect us, what can and should we as individuals or our communities or our schools or our political leaders do about it? What is to be done? Now what? So these are the three things that all of our programs try to bring to communities and schools across Montana, like we've been doing for the past 22 years. I want to give a very quick thank you right back to Chris and the Museum of the Rockies team here, who are our partners in this event and who have opened up their beautiful space here for us. Thank you so much to you and everybody who's making this possible. I also want to thank you. Yes. Thank you for that. I also want to quickly thank the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. They help us bring this and so many more programs all across Montana. Special thanks to them. Now, let me introduce Ambassador Robert Loftus. Ambassador Loftus served in the State Department and Foreign Service from 1980 to 2012, where he held a variety of assignments, including acting coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, special representative for avian and pandemic influenza, senior advisor for security negotiations and agreements, ambassador to Lesotho, and deputy chief of mission in Mozambique. He was most recently an interagency professional in residence at the United States Institute for Peace. From 2007 through 2009, he was the deputy commandant and senior advisor for international affairs of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at the National Defense University, where he also taught strategic leadership. In early 2008, Ambassador Loftus was the lead negotiator for a status of forces agreement with Iraq. He was also the Deputy Executive Director of Implementation Planning Team for the creation of the Department of Defense's new Africa Command. Ambassador Loftus was also a professor of the practice of diplomacy at Boston University's Party School of Global Studies from 2013 to 2020. And Ambassador Loftus is a community member here in Bozeman. So would you please help me welcome Ambassador Robert Loftus.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should have probably coordinated my comments with Chris's because there's going to be a little bit of similarity here, but not too much, I hope. So what I wanted to start with is that if you look at the best journalism and the best political diplomatic reporting, they share three very important qualities. The first is a dedication to truth. Readers need the confidence that what is being presented to them is accurate and conveys as much of the truth as possible. Good foreign policy decisions can only be made on the basis of accurate information and assessment, even if sometimes that news is unwelcome. The second is answering the question, why does this information matter? Which is what you just pointed out. How does it affect the reader's interests or the national interest in that country? If you can't answer that question, all you're doing is presenting some kind of very interesting, I hope, interesting anecdote. And the third is making connections to developments elsewhere or to events elsewhere. It's often easy to look at what's happening in your country or what you're reporting on in a silo, rather than looking at the broader ramifications. So in the case of Ukraine, what's going on now, for example, it's tempting to focus on battlefield victories and defeats, maybe what's happening in Europe, and then to ignore what's happening to food prices in places like Africa and what that will have for instability and then hence for migration from those countries. So tonight we have two speakers who epitomize those values and I think who are uniquely qualified to speak on the topic of US-China relations in the light of the war in Ukraine. And I would imagine that given the speed of events that they have been updating their remarks up until a few minutes ago. So Ambassador, and I don't know, do I call you Ambassador or Senator, or both? Senator, Ambassador? Max. Max actually doesn't really need an introduction to any Montana audience. He is Montana's longest. I think Senator Tester might do the largest. Longest serving senator, first elected to the House of Representatives in 1974, and then 4 years later to the United States Senate, where he served until 2014. As a longtime supporter of a broader rules-based international trading system, Senator Baucus, Max, led in gaining approval for new trade agreements with 11 countries. Most notably, he was instrumental in opening permanent normal trading relations with China, which in the process, I think, helped China's massive economic growth over the last 20 years, and also ended an annual acrimonious and largely fruitless debate about what our trading relationship would be with that country. That also led to China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. Fittingly, he was nominated by President Obama to be ambassador to China and was approved unanimously by the Senate in 2014, and he served there until January of 2017. Upon his return from Beijing, Senator Baucus and his wife formed the Baucus Group LLC, and he now devotes much of his time to the Max S. Baucus Institute at the University of Montana, which is dedicated to giving young adults opportunities in politics, government, and study abroad. Now, managing America's relations, official relations with a country central to the United States interests, but really can't be characterized as a friend or a foe or an adversary is no simple task. And just to note a handful of the things that arose during his tenure there, which demonstrated how the relationship with China was both cooperative and competitive. Almost immediately upon his arrival in China, he had to deal with the ramifications of having the Department of Justice of the United States indict 5 Chinese nationals on allegations of hacking trade secrets from US firms. which then threatened to blow up all of the cybersecurity cooperation between the United States and China. On the other side of the ledger, following that fairly closely, was that same year Presidents Obama and Xi Jinping signed the joint pledge to reduce carbon emissions, one of the major advances in cooperation to protect the global environment. But then, not to keep things too simple, his tenure also coincided with the time where tensions were rising between the United States and China over China's increasingly aggressive claims to the South China Sea, including their building of man-made islands and increasingly asserting their claimed rights over the airspace and the seabed. So indeed, that old Chinese curse of may you live in interesting times, I think pretty much applied to the tenure there. Joining Ambassador Baucus is Tiff Roberts, who was an award-winning writer and speaker, spent more than 20 years in China as the China bureau chief and Asia news editor for Bloomberg Business Week. I must also note that he is fluent in Mandarin Chinese. Tiff has witnessed, reported, and commented on the growth of the Chinese economy as it became one of the most powerful in the world. His most recent reporting focused on how legacy policies from China's past are leading to growing inequality and social tensions and holding back China's development, which is answering the question of why is this important, connecting the dots and adding nuance to the conventional narrative of China's inevitable rise. Tiff's first book, so are there going to be more?
I hope so.
Okay. First book, which is called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, the Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World, was chosen by The Economist magazine as one of 2020's best books. Tiff is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative and a fellow at the University of Montana's Marine and Mike Mansfield Center. He's recently launched a China trade newsletter called Trade War. So it gives me great pleasure to turn the stage over to Max and Tiff. Please enjoy the program. I look forward to the discussion.
All right, well, thank you, Ambassador Loftus, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Chris, Montana World Affairs Council, for hosting this, and also Chris from the Museum of the Rockies. This is a beautiful venue here. It's my first visit. I was telling Chris earlier, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity and honored to join you, Ambassador Baucus, tonight. I think I'll frame my comments, and I'll try to keep them not too long, by discussing another speech that was actually given exactly 1 week ago by China's president and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. He addressed this speech, I think it was through video, but he addressed it to attendees at something called the Boao Forum, which is held annually down on southern island of China. And you can think of it as sort of China's answer to Davos. I attended many of them in my years as a journalist in China. And the speech by President Xi was really notable by what he said and also what he did not say. First, some of the things that he mentioned and the places he talked about. He talked for quite a while about the developing world and had a very positive message on how China would help the developing world continue to rise. He talked specifically about how the world must pay attention to needs, including poverty alleviation, food security, development finance, and I believe industrialization in the developing world. He also spent quite a bit of time talking about Asia, and his focus there was on cooperation and unity, and again, the role that China could play as sort of an anchor to help continue the development of Asia. He mentioned the it's called RESET, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Organization, which is now a very large trade organization, which China helped create, grouping Asian countries and some other countries around the world. He also reiterated China's intention to try to join the Comprehensive Progressive, let's see if I can get this right, Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the successor organization to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And that is interesting, of course, because at one point the US was very much promoting the TPP. We pulled out and it was formed regardless. And now China is, at the time when the US was promoting it, it was seen by some as almost being an organization to deal with the rise of China in some way. Well, now China is talking very seriously about joining it. What Xi Jinping did not mention, first of all, was the United States. Not a single word about the United States. He did, however, he did not mention Europe either, and he did not mention Russia or Ukraine. In his comments, however, he did make he did say some things that seemed to be directly pointed, very pointed comments or remarks, almost a jibes at what seemed to be the U.S. So he mentioned that he spoke out against what he called wanton sanctions, and he said that the world must not engage in Cold War thinking. He also made a very pointed comment about Asia, where he said large and strong countries, regardless whether they're from Asia or from outside, should never cause trouble in Asia. Instead, he said they should contribute to the splendor, was the word he used, of Asia. And this was seen, I think, rightly so, by many people as a direct comment at China's perception of U.S. meddling in Asia. Again, he did not mention Russia, but he did use a phrase, in indivisible security, which happens to be a phrase that Russia's been using to defend their invasion of Ukraine. And the basic concept is, and Xi Jinping talked about this as well, that no nation, through pursuing its own security, can threaten the security of another nation. This was a series of comments he made. The last one on indivisible security, I think, was read, rightly so, including by the State Department spokesman here, Ned Price, as a full-throated a full-throated statement of continuing support for Russia in Ukraine, or at least a statement that China has no intention of joining international sanctions against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or listening to some of the calls that have been coming from the US and European partners to join that. I guess the question is, why would Russia do that? We've seen this, tremendously, quite impressive global effort to maybe not global, but bringing in many of the nations of the world to put sanctions on Russia, to condemn the invasion of Ukraine. And China's decision to not do that has actually been, I think, damaging to its global reputation. Unfortunately, even before China decided to stand with Russia to a degree on Ukraine, we could see that 9 out of 10 Americans viewed China as either a competitor or even an enemy. This is a recent Pew Research poll. And I think it's also fair to say that Europe is their opinion of China is being hardened to a degree because of their decision to not actually really condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So why would China pursue this? And I will finish here quickly. it seems clear, and China's made these statements, that they, believe it or not, see Russia to a large degree as the aggrieved partner in this terrible tragedy that's happening now in Ukraine. The idea, and they have said this rather directly, or the belief that they have, is that NATO's westward expansion pushed Russia's back against a wall. And Russia, because it has to protect its security, its indivisible security, had to respond. China, by the way, sees a parallel with the US presence in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly the longtime close relationship between the US and Taiwan, and the weapons sales to Taiwan, and the increasingly frequent high-level senior officials that are visiting from Washington, D.C. to Taipei. So China believes that Russia, to a degree, it's understandable how they responded, that they had to go into Ukraine. And frankly, they, again, see, they feel themselves like they too are victims of expansion, in this case by the US in Asia, and particularly related to Taiwan. I say all this, and I hope it's not too negative. I lived in China for 23 years. I have relatives in China. My daughter was born there. And it's a country that I have a tremendous affection for. But I say this because I do think that we are at a very perilous state in our relationship with China. And I'm afraid that I think what we've seen with China's response to this global crisis that we're seeing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine has not been comforting at all. As a matter of fact, it's been quite disturbing to watch how China has approached that. So I'm going to stop here, and I probably talked too long already anyway, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. Tiff. First, I do want to thank the World Affairs Council. We need more of these. We need more opportunities for more people to engage on a lot of critical matters, because it does make a difference. I'll be very brief. I'm going to divide my remarks into 3 different subjects. One is U.S.-China relationship. I don't know how I can summarize that in 2 or 3 minutes. The second is China-Ukraine. And third is what the council is all about. Now what? What do we do? Clearly, the U.S.-China relationship is going south. It's going south fast. It's near free fall. And I think the critical time when it really began, or at least obviously began, was in Anchorage, Alaska, when Secretary Blinken and the top Chinese guy, his name is Yang Jiechi, had a little interchange. And that was the moment when China thought that it had arrived. It no longer is going to be badgered by the United States. It's going to do its own thing. It's going to go its own way. And up to that point, I think the United States has felt that it could kind of push China around a little bit. At first, the United States felt it could engage China, talk to China. That was certainly the policy when I was over there. That is more communications back and forth. We have all these exchanges, and this and that. And the more we engage them, the more they're going to be like us. That was the assumption when I was over there. And that started to change when I was there, because you could see that all these engagements had virtually no effect on China. It's not going to change China's culture, certainly. And it's not going to change China's view of the world. It is true that the Chinese feel that during the past 200 years, they call it the 2 centuries of humiliation they're put upon. Prior to that time, their GDP, frankly, was the world's largest about 200 years ago. It's larger than the United States, larger than they got by far. And then Japan came into China, US, and things went kind of poorly for them. But now they think their time's arrived. They think the wind's at their back. They got bounce in their step. Now is the time. Well, forget it. Their economy is growing so fast. It's really interesting that we're talking about China today, because Nixon went to China 50 years ago, a couple days ago. Nixon opened up China 50 years ago. And here we are kind of discussing the 50th anniversary and where are we and what's happened. So much has happened. Nixon was courageous when he went to China at that time. Don't forget, that was the Vietnam War period. That was Korean War. That was gutsy. It's the right thing to do. I think, frankly, very parochially, pat ourselves on the back, Mike Mansfield had a lot to do with it. You read a speech he gave in 1968 or 4, I've forgotten which. It's amazing. It's one of the best speeches I've seen written by anybody. And he wrote it himself. If you look at it, you know, prior to word processors, and you see words crossed out and underlined and this, that. It's his speech. It was about China. And he was talking about how we got to think constructively about China. It's amazing. I know he talked to Kissinger, he talked to Nixon, and had a lot to do with Nixon going to China. He's an amazing man, Mike Mansfield. So anyway, lots happened in 50 years. It's during the time I was there, you could just feel the policy of engagement start to slip away. China started to feel its oats. It's pretty big, pretty important. Don't forget their population is 4 times the size of ours, geographically the same area as ours, and the scale over there blows you away. They produce half the world's coal, consume half the world's coal, steel, aluminum, you go down the list. It's a big country. The scale is tremendous. And when you visit China, you know, you see a lot of the infrastructure they built. Now, Tiff's written a book about all the poverty. That's true. There's no question about it. There's something called hukou, which is, it keeps people down on the farm. But they know about that. The Chinese leadership is trying to deal with that. They're trying to deal with poverty. Xi Jinping constantly talks about raising Chinese out of poverty. And then actually, I think the record's pretty good. Their GDP has grown 175 times from where it was 50 years ago. 175 times larger where it was 50 years ago. They're going. Now they got problems. But the relationship's gone south because China feels it's kind of, hey, we're equal to the United States now. In addition to that, frankly, they're tired of all the sanctions that we impose on them. My judgment is sanctions don't work. They don't change behavior. They're counterproductive. All our sanctions, whether it's Xinjiang, Uyghurs, or whether it's Hong Kong, or whether it's military involvement or semiconductor, it does not change behavior. In fact, it has the opposite effect. They dig in their heels. Well, why is that country telling us what to do? You know, we're our own country, we're our own culture. You know, they don't have any effect. So it's made them even more angry. It's causing them even more distant. All the name calling by the United States, by the way, doesn't help either. We call China this, that, won't name names, but our people call China, the word enemy comes up. Well, the more we criticize China publicly and call them the enemy, I'm telling you, the more they're going to be our enemy, the more it's going to be difficult. It's just very tough. And there's so much to talk about, you know. But policy today is driven by domestic politics. U.S. policy is driven by domestic politics. By that I mean members of the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, both administration, or the more you can criticize China, the more you get political points. That's how you get reelected in 2022 or maybe presidential. Look at all the presidential candidates, Republican side, criticizing China. That's how they want to get the nomination in 2024. So it's, and I'm not saying China's a lot of fault. China's a lot of bad things, no question. The market's closed. They've done a lot of bad stuff and so forth. And you know, let's talk about Ukraine. First of all, back up. China has arrived, and we have to recognize that. We have to deal with it. We can't think that China's going to go away. We keep criticizing. That's my first point. Second, I think the Ukraine war is going to drag on for a long time. It's not going to be over tomorrow. Why? Because Putin is so proud. He's already cornered. He'll do whatever he has to do to get as much as he can out of Ukraine. Our allies are helping a lot. Biden wants to send $50 billion worth of arms to Ukraine. Other countries are doing the same. Zelensky is amazing how he's rallied his country and people in the world. It's astounding. Well, that surprised China. I don't think China knew what Putin was going to do. They had no business. I don't think so. But they're surprised at how poorly Putin is done in Ukraine. They're very surprised. It put them back. They're up. They're back-footed now. Russia's an ally. They're back-footed because of Putin's comparison, at least from their perspective. Add to that, as Tiff said, it's true. They're kind of caught in a quandary. China, what do we do now? He's our buddy, he's our friend. But the more we don't sanction, say we're going to sanction, the more we don't agree that there should be sanctions against him, more our reputation as Chinese is sullied. And it's true. America, Europe, the United States, therefore thinks less of China. They're in a tough spot, real tough spot. But China cares about one thing, China. and they're going to use Putin the best they can. They'll cut a deal, get better energy prices after a while. They'll give a little military aid, but not too much, because they don't want to get the spotlight. But after this thing gets resolved in some way, then they're going to come in and they're going to help. And don't forget too, that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are two peas in the pot. They're authoritarian. They're authoritarians. They understand each other. And add to that, from China's perspective, Russia is a good pawn to play, or maybe a knight, maybe a castle. I don't know. But at least it's a player that China can use as China grows, and as much as it possibly can. Might add here too, China is really not a military aggressive power. They're not. Look at the history. Little border wars in India. They went into Korea. We kind of helped them get into Korea because we were over there first. And we've been in Afghanistan, Iraq, all that. We're more the military aggressor, honestly, than is China. China's a big economic power. They want to be one of the world's hegemons economically. And it's the long haul. That's why they're building all these industries. They pulled up the bridge, their own semiconductor manufacturing business, you name it. Because if they see, if they can't trust the United States as much, they don't like all this criticism, so they can do it themselves. Third part. So now what? I think that we are making a mistake, the United States, by allowing the relationship between the United States and China to be so bipolar. It's them against us, them against us. We're doing a little bit the same with Russia. Them against us, them against us. Well, guess what? If it's more them against us, say China, that divide is going to get wider. It's just going to happen. It just is. When the dust settles after Ukraine, the tectonic plates will have shifted. There's going to be a new, if not a new world order, there'll be a whole new set of arrangements around the world. It's hard to predict what they're going to be, but it's going to happen. It always happens in a major military conflict. So what should we do? Point 3. I think we should think, it's hard now. Politically, it won't happen until after 2024. I think we have to start think much more about that, not embracing China, not embracing Russia, but looking for a kind of new order where we're more working together better, because the current bipolarism is not going to work. And a lot of third world countries don't want to have to line up behind the United States or line up behind China. They want to do their own thing, especially in Southeast Asia. And gosh, you'd be amazed number of bastards that say, you know, G Max, we talk about TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Oh, you got to join that. Why? Because if you pass that, then we can better play you Americans off against the Chinese. You know, Singaporeans will say that. Vietnamese will say that. They don't want to have to choose sides. They like to do deals with US. They want to do deals with China. So we got to find a way. It's early, but we have to reorient our thinking, I think, not just keep criticizing China. Sanctions don't work. But we have to recognize, in the interest of our national security, that we got to build up our army, our military might, just in case something bad might happen. And it's so easy to spend money on guns and planes and warships. That's easy, and that's what we're doing. The hard thing to do is figure, okay, now how are we going to work better together as countries? I'll finish here. One thing that really struck me is this. You know, all the top level political headlines, criticism back and forth. Really, when Bush comes to shove, Chinese people are just like American people. They're the same. And what is that? What do I mean by that? People in China, the US, and around the world basically care about basic stuff. Number one, decent income. Want to have food on the table. Want to take care of their kids. A good education for their kids. Decent health care. Air and water pollution addressed. Be left alone a little bit. People are the same. And if we recognize, really, although China's culture is different, they're not going to change in Xinjiang. That's never going to happen, as long as I'm alive. But basically, the people in China have the same kind of interests that we have. Then maybe it's more likely we'll find some way to work together than we have thus far. But this bipolar stuff is going to cause problems. Mark my words.
Okay, it's on. How do you like that? So thank you very much, Ambassador Baucus and Tiff, for those opening remarks. So now we've got, I don't know, 45, 50 minutes where we're going to hand over to you, the audience, for questions on this. I would just ask respectfully 3 small points during the question and answer period. First is, it's a public forum, so I'd be grateful if we could keep everything civil and respectful like we do in Montana. The second is, to keep on theme, we're talking about China and the U.S. relationship with China in light of the Ukraine. So I appreciate that. And lastly is, please ask a question. That's something that ends in a question mark, not just a long commentary on your opinion. I'm sure it's interesting.
I'll second that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure it's interesting that I'm sure there's a lot of people who do have questions. And so if you could come to the point on a question. I will work the room here with the microphone. I'll run up and down. I'm fairly athletic, but if you could move a little bit towards the aisles, I appreciate that. You don't have to. But if you're ready, let's begin with audience Q&A. Who's gonna right there? I'm coming to you. If you don't mind, I'll hold the microphone for you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the discussion, very energetic discussion. So my question is, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, is it going to start nuclear proliferation? Is it going to trigger this? Because the smaller countries feel that now what North Korea is doing, and the smaller countries are neighboring from Russia, will they get more into nuclear arms?
Well, I'll start. I don't think so. Going back into it, Kim Jong-un learned one thing. Gaddafi made a big mistake when he gave up nuclear. It was no longer a nuclear power. Kim Jong-un, because he's North Korea's nuclear power, has strength, he has leverage. He can rattle the cage, he gets attention. But then he's not going to push the button unless he's totally crazy. That's possible, but I don't think it's going to happen. In Ukraine and Putin's rattling the cage too, but to get attention and for leverage when there is some negotiation, whenever we get there. One thing Putin understands is power. That's all he understands is power. And so his military prowess wasn't very powerful, but he's trying to regroup now. So he rattles the nuclear cage to kind of get more power. He's also cut off natural gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria to get more power, threatening to cut off supplies to Germany to get more power. But I think he just rattled the cage to get attention. And, he's an egomaniac. And so he kind of likes doing all this. I don't think it's going to come to nuclear proliferation.
I could just add one thing. I absolutely agree with the ambassador. I do think that one of the interest, sort of looking at this from the side here, one of the big debates has been what are the lessons China is taking away from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? What does it mean in terms, if they were ever, God forbid, to take military action in the Taiwan Strait, for example? What might the response be? And one of the one argument, and I think this is valid, is that they, as Ambassador Baucus also said earlier, they were quite shocked to see the level of resistance from the Ukrainians and the inability of Russia to finish this off. And I think Russia and Putin thought that they could go in and it wouldn't last nearly so long. And I think China looks at that and says, "Oh, that's a bit alarming." I think they're also a bit alarmed by the quickness and the comprehensiveness, relative comprehensiveness of the sanctions that have been brought against Russia. I think on the nuclear question, however, they have a much more, something that might give them a little bit of comfort or solace, which is the fact that because Russia is a nuclear power, the Biden administration and NATO have been very careful not to get directly involved. Thank God, I think, for the world. And of course, China is a nuclear power as well. So I think they've made note of that as well.
Good evening, and thank you for spending this evening with us. My question is, we had the supply chain disruptions during COVID, followed by war, and the trade disruptions. So, what this would mean for U.S. agriculture?
Well, we'll go first this time.
I think this is one for you.
Well, disruptions are incredible. Start with the obvious, Ukraine. Estimates are that its economy is good, its GDP is going to plummet by at least a half. And think of all the reparations that are necessary for Ukraine. I forgot the figures, but Ukraine supplies a large amount of the world's grain, wheat, corn, as the Soviet Union does. I mean, Russia does too. Well, short term for Montana farmers, it's great. Prices are way up. That's the cruel irony, often, of war. They're financial winners and they're losers. The little tragic deaths and destruction that occur. COVID is clearly adding more disruption to supply chains, especially now in China or Shanghai. Most of Shanghai has been just shut down. I've talked to friends there. It's incredible. I mean, it's almost like a war zone because it's been shut down. A lady there has lost 10 pounds. She's finally got some cucumbers. Her boyfriend just told me. And I have other friends over there yesterday. We're going back and forth social media, same thing in Shanghai. So it's going to take a while to work through this, and I think there are clearly going to be disruptions. It's another example of more deglobalization of the world. Up until about 5, 6, 7 years ago, the assumption was we globalize, we trade. It just helps everybody. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's gone the other direction. Got to hunker down, be self-sufficient. That destroys supply chains because you can't get supplies anymore. Whether it's semiconductors, or telephones, you name it, computers, or add to tech, it's agriculture as well. Ports balled up. I saw a photograph of Shanghai Harbor, 400 ships out there just waiting to load or unload. I mean, it's incredible. But it's life is full of curveballs. Things happen you can't predict. And COVID clearly is added to, and Ukraine, the two together, which are exacerbating a trend in terms of disruptions in supply chains. There's already had begun 5 or 6, 7 years ago with the divide between, say, the U.S. and China.
Yeah, we'll have the microphone over.
Thank you for being here and presenting to us. My question is, with the relationship between China and the United States right now, do you see that our efforts in combating global warming are going to be effective? Are they falling apart? Do we still have hope.
Well, I'll jump in. You want to speak to Tiff?
Jump in.
Well, Tiff mentioned it. Or no, I guess Bob did. One of the proudest moments when I was serving over there is helping get the Chinese to address global warming. When I first started talking to President Xi Jinping, and it's like talking to a fence post. I mean, nothing. And not just me, Secretary Kerry, Obama came over, and we kept talking to the Chinese about, hey, we got to do something about this. And after a while, you see a glimmer of interest in the Chinese. Why? Because Xi Jinping wanted to be on the world stage with the world, leader of the free world, Barack Obama. Second, Xi Jinping could show that that was an opportunity to push back against the non-reformers. And third, there's an opportunity to develop renewable energy industries, wind, solar. So, hey, we could do this and we could subsidize these wind, solar, we could just make a killing here. And that's, they're opportunists. I tell you, they want to make a buck and they find a way to do it. And so, but then when we pulled out under President Trump, that did kind of set things back. And sure, we're back again, but Ukraine is setting it back, frankly, because we're looking for energy. So keep gas prices down. It's complicated. It's tough. I talked to Secretary Kerry just a short while ago, and I know he's frustrated, partly because of changes in the world energy needs as opposed to for conventional energy as opposed to renewables. The Chinese, he wants to de-link climate from other US-China issues. The Chinese kind of say they will, but they aren't. They're looking for leverage whenever they can get it. But having said, and as you know, they're building so many more new coal plants. It's almost off the charts, all they do, because they want to keep the economy going, and because of COVID, and because of supply chain disruptions, they got to keep things going, short term, at least. So it's my judgment is difficult, but we have no choice but to just keep at it. Secretary Kerry believes, and I think he's right, that the real answer here is development around the world. New technologies, we're going to find new ways to do stuff. And it's all across the board. Americans are very innovative, and we're going to find ways to help address this issue. But is China to be a partner? I don't know. It goes back to the earlier point I made. I'll tell you, they're much more likely to be a partner if we don't call them names. They're much more likely to be a partner if we don't keep sanctioning them. They're more likely to be a partner if we work with them, I guess. Now, China's a lot of bad stuff. I'm not standing here to champion China at all. But we can't change China's behavior directly, but we could change ours a little more directly. And I just feel that we should try to find ways to deal with China a little more, so that we can address its climate, its COVID, its nuclear issues like North Korea and Iran, et cetera. Yes, we got to work with them. They're there. They're not going to go away. They're big too, and we got to deal with it.
I'd just add that Xi Jinping himself has made tackling climate change a major priority. And if Xi Jinping says anything is a major priority, you can be sure that the government will continue to focus on it, even when it's a struggle, because his name is on the line, and he's a very ambitious and proud man, as one would expect the leader of China. So I think climate change is something that they do want to continue to pursue. As Ambassador Baucus was saying, having said that, whenever the economy goes south in China, you see very quietly all the coal plants start back up. They do have the largest reserves of coal in the world under the ground. It's pretty dirty coal, a lot of it. And so when the economy goes south, they tend to quietly start all the coal plants back up. The other thing they've done, frankly, which is disappointing, is they've sold a lot of their coal-fired plant technology overseas in places like Pakistan through the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. And so even as they try to clean up in China to a degree, they may say, well, we've got to be practical here, and we have this wonderful technology that just happens to have very high emissions. We don't want it here anymore, but we're not just going to shut it down. We're going to sell it overseas.
I think it's gonna chuckle at it. Sometimes there are days in Beijing, it's called Beijing blue. The sky's blue. Why is it blue? What happened? Well, there might be some event coming up, and so the government shuts down all the coal-fired power plants, which are upwind. So a day or two later, it's gorgeous, beautiful weather. Beijing, it's nice.
I'll just add quickly that Ambassador Baucus hosted Secretary Kerry last week in a climate conversation. And if you're interested, it was fascinating. If you're interested on the Max Baucus Institute website, you can catch that entire show. It was really wonderful. Question, I'm looking on this side too here.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. You brought up this bit of a retrenchment of globalization we're currently in. I think one of the promises of globalization is greater economic interdependence, bring about peace and improved relations between countries. And we've seen maybe that not prove to be the case with Russia at the moment. To what extent does that have an impact currently on China? Do we still believe that the premise is still valid that greater economic independence will improve relations, or do we need to reassess that given our dependence on China? Is that potentially a vulnerability, or what does that mean?
I think one thing we shouldn't lose sight of is the fact that I think for obvious reasons here in the U.S. we tend to think of it as economic integration is good. Shall we pursue that with China? Shall we try to do more trade agreements and so on? Which I think we should, by the way. China, of course, has very strong opinions on this itself. And what we've seen over the last few years, unfortunately, I think, is a move towards a bit more of a closed system. And this is not something that they decided to do overnight. It was to a large degree also prompted by actions taken in Washington, D.C., the trade war under the Trump administration, the sanctions against some of China's biggest, most powerful technological stars, companies like Huawei and ZTE, that China is very proud of, that have been very much hurt by U.S. sanctions. So China, in response, has realized that they do need to focus more on what they call their own indigenous technology. They do need to ensure that they have a high level of self-reliance in key parts of the economy. They do not want to be in a situation where they're deeply reliant on the U.S., for example, and geopolitical tensions or bilateral tensions mean that their supply of whatever important good it is is suddenly cut off. So we are seeing, I would argue, this tendency in Beijing towards a more closed system. They actually have a policy they call the dual circulation system, and it's dual in a nod that they will continue to trade with the world. But the real emphasis of that policy is creating a more internally reliant and stronger domestic economy. And that includes certainly having, and no surprise here, their own indigenous technology. They put almost $1 trillion, I think, into their semiconductor program. And also much more of a reliance they're hoping on domestic consumption. So not as reliant on trading with the world, but more reliant on the spending power of the Chinese people.
Yeah, I agree with what Tiff said. All of that. It's happening. There's something called 2025. It's a Chinese plan to all these technologies by 2025. Now they have new ones. New plans called 2030 with AI, artificial intelligence, and all the new technologies of the future. They want to be the world leader in AI in 2030. They're going to spend a lot of money doing it, trying, and they're going to waste a lot of money because when central government said, hey, we're going to be the world leader in 2030, now it goes all across the country, and party secretaries in all these provinces, hey, that's what our boss said, so we got to do something about that. So those local party secretaries, the provinces talk to the banks lend a lot of money, a lot of easy term money for AI and so forth. So a lot of it's wasted, but it's a big country, so they're going to do okay, frankly. I go back to what I've said in my last remarks. If things are going south, but the bigger question, what do we do about it? You know, does it happen? Continue letting it, encourage it to go south? That's where we are right now today, as I see it. And one point is kind of interesting. During all this talk about China and the US, I think that the trade between the US and China last year was about $465 billion. It's going up. The trade numbers are going up every year, even despite all that's going on. Part of it's because we import so much stuff. We buy a lot of Chinese stuff. We still do. And Tiff's right, they're trying to move from exports a little bit toward domestic consumption to support their economy, but they still export a lot of stuff, which we buy, and we're paying for it. We're borrowing money to pay for it. It all adds, it adds up.
Thank you. I'm just curious, in your research and your work and your kind of the trajectory that you can see, it's just broader than ours. And there's always this question of what keeps you up at night, and then what makes you most hopeful in terms of these issues.
What's the second question?
What makes you most hopeful? Like in terms
What?
of most hopeful.
Oh,
And it's a broad question, but I'm just curious in terms of these topics we're covering today. Like what makes you most worried? And then what makes you most hopeful in terms of solutions?
I'll jive because you want to. I'm most worried about, you know, United States thinking too short-term with respect to China and just keep criticizing because it's so easy. That's how you get elected. You know, so many Republican, Democratic senators, hey, you know, it's easy for me to criticize China. I've talked to senators who say, gee, why don't you say something constructive? Oh, I'll have my head taken off. I can't do that. I'll get primaried if I'm a Republican. You know, the right wing will primary me. Or if someone else more right wing will primary me. Most members of Congress want to keep their jobs. They really, it's not a big surprise. It's kind of where they are. So what worries me the most is we're going to keep thinking short term, and we're going to. Now, what am I most hopeful about? Basically, it's ingenuity of America. We're a really innovative country. We've been through a lot of bad stuff in the past, whether it's great New Deal, Pearl Harbor, war, Sputnik. You know, we rally when we really have to. And I don't know if we're quite that point yet, but it's there. I'll amend my first point. I'm worried about social media. I'm worried about short attention spans. Internet. People think critically less now than they used to. And it's going to glibly, lively look at their post, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatnot. It's so easy. I worry a lot about that. But again, I just look at, we got two choices in life. We try or do nothing. And it's so much more fun to try. And that's what really gives me hope. It's fun. I like doing it. And we're intrinsically a great country. We just tap into that. And also what gives me hope is there's going to come a time, I'm repeating myself, where I think America's going to realize, hey, we got to figure out some way to deal with China. And this, this isn't working. Let's try something new, different.
I just add quickly, I share the same concerns with the ambassador about short-term thinking and this us versus them mentality. which seems to be rife in Washington, DC, and unfortunately perhaps spreading throughout the country as well. On looking across to China, one of the things that does concern me is Xi Jinping, who I was in China as a reporter for almost a quarter century, lived longer there than anywhere else I've lived, including Montana. Montana second. I've spent almost as much time in Montana as I did in China, even though I was born here. But I think I watched 5 party congresses. I was there as a reporter for 5 party congresses. They happen every 5 years. And they're about to have their next one this fall. And, I covered several generations of Chinese leaders, 3 of them actually, to be specific. And Xi Jinping, I think, has a level of ambition, which is important for China to have an ambitious leader, but also can be a little bit scary. And as I said, we've got a party congress coming up in October, November of this year. We won't know until probably a week before they announce it. The secretive nature of the Chinese Communist Party means that they don't tell you. It was fun being a reporter and not knowing until like 4 days before.
It's not much better when you're the ambassador, I'll tell you
That they're
that.
gonna do.
They don't tell us either.
No. So, but Xi Jinping, pretty much there's unanimity that very likely that Xi Jinping is going to stay on for an unprecedented 3rd term in power. And he actually successfully had the Constitution of China amended so that he could stay on for a 3rd term as president. And as the ambassador was mentioning earlier, I think there's a sense in Beijing that momentum is on our side. And Xi Jinping has said that. He also has said the East is rising and the West is declining. And that makes me nervous.
I might just add to that, onto that. We run the risk in America of being a little bit too concerned with, or maybe a little frightened about, quote, China's rise. We run the risk for 2 reasons. One, China's got a lot of problems, a ton of problems. Second, we are stronger than we give ourselves credit for a lot of the time. We just have to bring ourselves, work better together, and we could really lead in the best sense of the term.
I have a question. I'm always curious about how do we rank our relationship with different countries. I heard you talk about Southeast countries in Southern Asia. They want to police China. They also want to police United States. I think it's the same as the Philippines and South Korea. They want to police China. They also want to police United States. And now India, they want to police Russia and United States. So I never think our relationship with other countries is based on we have the same value. So you can say, oh, we share the same value like those European countries, but doesn't mean those European countries want to be Ukraine's best friend because they need the oil, they need a lot of things from Russia. So I am interested in Washington DC's attitude or about the relationship. Do they rank, for example, the relationship with China is more important than the relationship with Russia? Do they rank the relationship with China is much more important than the relationship than Taiwan? So even they may share the same value with Taiwan, they need to sacrifice somebody. That's so I'm curious about how do we make a decision? Which one should be the most important? Which one should be, should be sacrificed?
Oh, is my question too critical?
It's not too critical, no. I think the ambassador made I don't think I have probably the answer you're looking for, but I think the ambassador made a good point earlier, which is these countries, certainly those in the Asia Pacific around China, yeah, they're not interested in taking sides. And my understanding, and the ambassador would know more about this, having served in government, but my understanding is they would be quite open, in some cases, depending on the country, would privately tell the US, we are comfortable, or maybe we're even thankful that you continue to have a presence, military presence, in the Asia Pacific. On the other hand, they do not want to be told that they need to join sanctions against China. In some cases, they're deeply, deeply reliant on their economic and trading relationships with China, perhaps far more than they are with the US. You look at commodity rich countries like Mongolia, which has a very difficult history with China. They simply cannot exist right now as an economy, a functioning economy, without a very close relationship with China.
Well, the short answer is we don't want to have to pick sides, frankly. We don't want to have to sacrifice. Trying to figure out what is best for the United States, but that's very complicated. What is best for the United States? Well, we want a good economy. We want to espouse our values worldwide. You know, human rights, for example, freedom of speech, rule of law, independent judiciary. That's things we believe in. Now, not all countries have that, and other countries, China, don't have that system. But I think it's important for us to keep talking about our values, not jam it down their throat, but to keep talking about it. China is big, as we discussed. Interestingly, Russia is not. That country might span 11 time zones, but the economy of Russia is about the size of Italy or Spain. It's small. It's not nearly as large as we tend to think that it is. So, and I think Putin's going to go at one point or another. And when Putin goes, Russia's going to be a much different country, much different, and I think easier to deal with. China is different. China is large. They think long term. Xi Jinping will get his third term, but the more relevant point, I think, is that even though he wants to be the one that puts China on the map, one of the world's hegemons, I think that's true. Still, there's such nationalism in China. There's such a sense of history in China, thousands of years, that the momentum is going to continue even when President Xi is no longer on the scene. So China is very, very important. I often think that the standard of living of Americans, especially their kids and their grandkids, and of Chinese, very much depends upon the relationship U.S.-China. So much that happens in the world goes through China. For example, Kim Jong-un, there is going to be no agreement what to do about North Korea that doesn't go through China. China's got to be part of the deal. If China's not part of the deal, it ain't going to happen. And that's also true in lots of other parts around the world. They're so big, they're so influential. I don't want to say they're a big giant, but I'm saying that in many cases, there's no solution unless China is part of the deal. If China's on the UN Security Council, they can veto all kinds of stuff, and they do. The goal is not to override the veto. The goal is to kind of work with them. So I've worked with China with North Korea. To be honest, they just Xi Jinping told me this. Kim Jong-un drives them crazy. They'd like to influence that fellow over there, but they can't very much. Now, it's true about 70-80% of the trade from North Korea goes back and forth to China. But it's very hard for China to one small point here. China basically likes the status quo in Korea. It does not want Kim Jong-un to take over the peninsula. That's a bigger problem for them, frankly. And it doesn't want South Korea to take over. That's even bigger problem. They kind of like the status quo, kind of leave it the way it is. But anyway, and that's a long answer to the question. China's big. Taiwan's a big question here. It's a big, big question. As you know, our policy is strategic ambiguity with respect to Taiwan. We're kind of ambiguous about it. There are these things called the Shanghai Communiques. We have a one China policy, and it's complicated. I saw a poll the other day, half people in Taiwan think the United States will not come to its rescue if China invades. Don't know, it's a big question.
We used to hear a lot of concerns about intellectual property between the US and China. Where does that stand now, and how do we deal with it without it becoming a us versus them sort of problem?
I don't want to be first all the time.
When I moved to China, I was working at Business Week before it became part of Bloomberg, actually, 1995. And the first thing I had to learn was, what are the concerns of American companies in China? Top of the list was intellectual property rights. I think last week I heard, I can't remember who it was, a US official talking about the challenges of intellectual property rights in China. I think it continues to be a very large issue. I think it's just other issues have become equally large, whether it's protectionism, state subsidies of Chinese companies. So there's other issues certainly that are probably equally important, but intellectual property rights is still very much an alive issue for American companies in China.
Yeah, it's I think it is, but it's, what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China, AmCham, and they basically say intellectual property is not the top of the list now. What's top of the list now is market access, is get stuff approved. It just red tape. It's market access. It's all that stuff. It's harder to do business now in China than it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, 20 years. Yeah. Kind of interesting point here. China does have intellectual property courts, specialized courts dedicated to intellectual property suits. And most of the litigants are Chinese who are suing other Chinese, having their rights infringed. And most of the time, the courts rule when Americans are involved. The last that I saw, most of the time they rule in favor of Americans in these specialized courts. Now, one thing that I find a little encouraging is this. When I arrived over there, 2013, 14, there's a sense, it's pretty accurate, that gee, you sign a contract with a Chinese company, and then lo and behold, they don't agree to a certain provision of the contract. So you go to the company and say, hey, you're supposed to be doing this. It says right here in this contract, part B here. No, it doesn't say that. Chinese company will say, oh yes, it says that. So you argue about it. But you couldn't get it enforced in the courts. It just didn't work. So what they do, they go out and have a few drinks. The Chinese drink is baijiu, Moutai. And after several drinks, you kind of talk about it. You get to know your counterpart pretty well personally. So you kind of work out a deal. Okay, well, this is how we're going to resolve it. So much is based on personal relationships and trust based on personal relationships that way. It's also the same between Chinese companies, that same phenomenon. But by the time I left, as I'm told, that started to get a lot better. The contracts were enforced more according to the rule of law. And I don't know that, but I sense that it's something the same true with IP. One major company, American company, I'll mention his name, talked to the head guy over there, said, you have any problem with IP trade? Oh, no, it's no problem. He's the CEO of the company, he's a smart guy. And but it's a problem, but I think it's got to be addressed. We don't have a lot of leverage. That's what I put tariffs on. Goes to an earlier question. We got a bunch of tariffs on Chinese products coming to the United States. They got a bunch of tariffs on our products into China. It's something called phase 1 and phase 2. And Trump put them on. Biden's not taking them off. We're just kind of stuck there.
Just one thing quickly occurs to me. I have to mention the one of the very, very biggest issues facing American and foreign business right now is China's so-called COVID zero policy. And so you have people that, executives from American companies who have not been able to leave China for more than 2 years in some cases. You have a exodus of teachers from the international schools in Beijing and Shanghai. I know that environment well. My daughter spent the first part of her schooling in the international school system in Beijing. They're losing teachers. It's become increasingly hard to convince senior executives from companies to relocate, certainly with their families, to China. Well, they can't do it right now, of course, during the pandemic. But as the ambassador mentioned, the people to listen to often are certainly the business chambers. And you must know Jörg Budka, the European Chamber, been there for 30 years.
I know him very well.
So he's an old friend as well. And there's quite an interview with him that just came out where he says COVID zero is basically destroying it for us. If this does not change, if China, you have 363 million people under some form of lockdown in China. So that's more than the population of the US and Canada, for perspective. You have 40% of the economy affected. And as Jörg said, the European Chamber gentleman, again, he's been there 30 years. He knows China as well as any business person. He said this is going to destroy the environment for us because of this. Very much, by the way, it appears to be a Xi Jinping directed policy. His prestige is on the line here. He's committed to, for a variety of good reasons as well, to basically not allow the spread of COVID at all in China. Now he's facing Omicron. So it's a real challenge as well for the business community.
Yep.
I wonder if you can imagine the video fast forwarding a couple months and Russia actually loses the war with Ukraine. And as a result of massive casualties of the Russian army and the humiliation, Putin is actually deposed. What will be China's reaction if that occurs?
Look into the crystal ball.
Well, there are a bunch of ifs there. I like to often say, you use the biggest little word in the English language several times. Yes. Well, if all that happens, Putin is, well, what does losing mean? Not quite sure what that means. Let's assume they're crushed. He's gone. He's out. Maybe his general's overthrown in the long run. Something happens to him. The question is, okay, now what? How's China going to do with Russia? I think they kind of like that. They like dealing with Russia without Putin, because Putin's causing a lot of problems for them. And they start to do deals even more than they previously. Yeah, that's my sense. Putin's a thorn in everybody's side, to put it mildly. And I do think that Ukraine's going to be a mess until one way or another he's no longer on the scene.
I think we've mentioned the pragmatic nature as well of the Chinese government. I think the first thing they would do is tell the new leadership of Russia, we recognize you and let's do business. Let's continue the relationship. They are very practical in that way. And by the way, they are the #1 investor, larger than Russia, in Ukraine. As the ambassador was saying, they purchase large amounts of barley and wheat and I think some iron ore as well from the Ukraine, and they sell a lot. And some of China's biggest companies, they were developing the port systems. They were Kafka, one of the big trading companies like the Cargill of China, was involved in creating a huge grain processing facility in one of the Ukrainian ports. Huawei, the company that the US has sanctioned, was putting 5G into the Kiev subway system before the war started.
I think, I've said it, I think they kind of like it.
Okay, we've got time for one last question.
Thank you. So, sorry, Chris, it's 2 parts. It's quick. I think So first part is, I'm curious about Xi Jinping looking at what the US response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and going to school on that with his, I think, pretty clearly stated desire to unify China vis-a-vis Taiwan, and are not engaging militarily with Russia. And if you think that makes it more or less likely that he would take action to invade Taiwan in the next, once he's made leader for life, which seems likely in the next 18 months. Second question, because I know, Max, you have a lot of friends in China still, and I know, Tiff, you have relatives and friends in China. I'm just curious about, we hear a lot about how American perception of China, which is increasingly negative, just the average American, whoever that person is. Do you see the same thing in China with the average Chinese person's perception of America? Because I think that matters, or it should matter. So
I think on Taiwan, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think there's a real mixed message for them. And I do think the question at the beginning of the conflict related to China was, did they know, as the ambassador brought up? And Putin was in Beijing on February 3rd, meeting with Xi Jinping right before the Beijing Winter Olympics. But I think that we'll probably never know. But I do think it's fair to say that China, like Russia, thought that whether or not, and very possibly it was never conveyed to Xi that an invasion was imminent, but whether or not that was conveyed to him, I think they were like Russia thought that this would be a pretty simple matter, and it would not be so drawn out and bloody, and the level of resistance would not be so high. So I think that's something that it's probably given China pause as well. In Taiwan, you have people that over the last decade plus have increasingly, particularly the young people, are unwilling to see themselves as Chinese. You know, surveys show that they increasingly call themselves Taiwanese. They see what happened in Hong Kong with the national security law, and what I would argue is some broken promises from Beijing about giving Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy, which they promised to do until I think 2047, when 50 years after the British handed Hong Kong back to China in 1997. I think Taiwan, the message is taken that they absolutely do not want to be part of China. So I think China is concerned that there could be a high level of resistance from the Taiwanese people if they invaded. They're not going to give up quickly. On the other side, just quickly, I do think that they've been very mindful of the fact, again, as I said, that the US and NATO have been very careful not to be directly involved in the conflict, even as they sell weapons, of course. And that is because Russia is a nuclear power. And Biden has said that. China, of course, is a nuclear power. So I think that's worth mentioning, very much worth mentioning. I think just the second part really quickly. I do think that, and the ambassador was saying this, I do think that not just the party and the government, but the people of China often react very badly to this almost hectoring attitude, constant criticism from anybody, and certainly from the United States, and from friends and family and others. Something I would hear again and again is, why do you think that me having to represent the U.S. and I wasn't the ambassador, by the way. Why do you, as you American, why do you think that you get to be the policeman of the world? We are, we once had the world's largest economy. We went through something, as the ambassador mentioned, called the century of national humiliation. Well, it's not going to happen again, and we're rising. And so I do think you do see, unfortunately, increasingly negative opinions towards the U.S. Within China. And that's a very sad, it's not an accomplishment, that's a sad development, because for so many years, there's been very positive feelings in China towards the U.S. That's why, until the pandemic, we had such large numbers of Chinese students, which is wonderful, in our universities here in the United States.
Right. 2 points. When I was over there, boy, if there was one thing that China's government drilled into me, that Taiwan is a core issue. It's inviolate. It's existential to the Chinese party, the Chinese government. Others were Tibet, some great Xinjiang in the far west. But man, oh man, they cite our one China policy, which the United States has agreed to. The United States has agreed to a one China policy. Now, that's interpreted differently by us a little bit than by them, but that's what we agreed to back when Nixon was over there. There's something called the Shanghai Communique, which reinforces that. They keep reminding us of that. And they think it's theirs. The Japanese took it away from China. Then after the Civil War in China, nationalists went over back over to Taiwan. And so they think it's Chinese, it's theirs. It's kind of interesting. I was walking down the street one day, the big city in eastern and southwestern China. It's called Chongqing. About 8 o'clock in the evening, nice summer day. Saw some guys and the gal over at the table drinking beer and talking. So I thought, what the heck? Walk over and talk to them, see what's going on. And I love doing that, just walking up and saying, hi, what's going on? And sat down and I asked him, who are you? One guy's he was about 45 years old, machine shop operator for a newspaper there. Another guy's visiting from Taiwan, been there just 6-8 weeks. Third person was a student. Fourth ran the little cafe there. I asked first question, right off the top I asked, what's the future of Taiwan? First guy, well, it's ours. What do you mean it's yours? Is it yours next week, next month, next year? When's it yours? Oh, about 15 years. It'll be ours about 15 years. And we're on the table and they all agree, except the guy from Taiwan. No way. 80% of us have nothing to do with the mainland. But they talked about it, but the others thought, no, it's ours. Then I asked the question, when I say the United States, what comes to mind? First, openness, clean air, space, free speech, democracy. Around the table, so what do you all think when I say United States? Oh, same thing, basically. So I went back to the first guy. I said, well, when will China be a democracy? Oh, it'll never happen. Oh, we'd collapse. If we were a democracy, we just collapse. It wouldn't happen. But maybe about 15, 20 years from now, we might be a democracy. As Tiff said, at that time, Americans really liked the United States. So many, we issued like 300,000 student visas, Chinese visas, to Chinese students to come over and study in America. It's incredible. They all loved it. I worked at the desk there to talk to these kids when they come over. Often their parents were paying for it, and that's gratifying. But but that's fallen off now. It's not quite the same as once was. I think because we've demonized China so much. That's part of it. And I also, I think today a lot of Chinese people, I'll say middle-class people, are kind of wondering a little bit here, what's going on here. I think it's not, they don't like us as much as they once did.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Baucus, Tiff Roberts, for coming here to Bozeman tonight for this incredible event.